Welcome everybody, I'm John Wally, and today in episode 2 we're going to be covering installing Tenable OT in VMware. So let's jump in. The last time that we met in a previous episode, we kind of talked about infrastructure, what critical infrastructure was, what Tenable OT is. In this episode we're going to get some hands-on keyboard. So before we jump into ESXi, let's talk a little bit about where we get our software. So if you go to downloads.tenable.com, and I'm going to type this in so you can see this. It will take us to a download page. And one of the things I want you to pay close attention to is you have a couple of options when it comes to downloading Tenable OT Security. We could download databases and content and updates for plugins and that sort of stuff under the regular Tenable OT Security download link. However, what you'll find here is you're going to find things like hardware specifications, integration guides, user guides, that sort of stuff, but you don't actually see the software here until you get to the updates. When you get to the update section, what you'll see is CVEs and threat intelligence database. So this actually includes both the events and signatures for the intrusion detection piece, as well as some of the plugins that come with Tenable OT. So you'll see, but the actual application and operating system are not here. Where you find that is actually under Tenable Core. Now, Tenable Core is the operating system of choice by Tenable. So it's a version of Oracle 8 Linux at this time anyway. It may be future versions of Oracle Linux in the future, but it actually has a hardened version of that. So it has certain CIS benchmarks in there. There's other hardening. They have their own repositories and patching and that sort of stuff for the operating system that Tenable produces. On top of that, most of the applications that Tenable can run on top of the Tenable Core operating system. So as I clicked on this, you'll notice you have Tenable Core plus Nessus, Tenable Core plus Tenable SC or Security Center. You'll see Tenable Core plus Tenable OT. We're going to be working in this area of Tenable Core plus Tenable OT. Now there's certain downloads that we have here, and you say, well, we talked about loading this on ESXi, which is a VMware product. Why don't we download the OVA? So we'll have our VMware image, we'll download, and we'll be good to go. It's a much faster install. However, there's some problems with that. In the last video, we talked a little bit about what the hardware specifications were when we look at the documentation. And you'll see that our hardware actually runs a lot more CPUs, a lot more memory, and a lot more disk space. So I always recommend, even if you're installing on VMware, Hyper-V, some virtualized, or restoring from some other hardware that's out there that you've purchased, whether it be directly through appliance with Tenable or you're putting it on new hardware, that you actually download and use the Tenable Core, Tenable OT offline ISO. There's a lot of reasons for this. One, it's self-contained. You don't have to worry about problems with network configurations, that sort of stuff as you install. So let's go ahead and download this. You can pause the video if you need to, and we'll get ready. One other thing while you're going through the download, you may see a little lockbox like what you see here. We have to see this little padlock. That means that you're not logged in. If you have a Tenable community login, so that's community.tenable.com, if you can log in with that same username and password and downloads as you do in community. If you do not have a community account, but yet your company works with Tenable, try to find out who your primary contact is and inside your company, and that is given by that person within the company, not necessarily by Tenable themselves. So if you need to get access or you need to download these, that can usually happen that way. All right, so let's jump into ESXi. Now, before we jump into uploading our ISOs and getting everything kicked off and starting to build it, there's some network configurations that we need to change. So I've set this up by the default configurations that are in place when you first start. I'm going to go ahead and view my virtual switch so you can see what this looks like. Now, by default, you'll have a physical adapter, maybe more than one. You'll have a management network that has an IP address that's on your local area network, and then you'll have a VM network. You'll notice that these are on VLAN ID 0. Now yours may be different, but if you're doing this in a lab, I recommend keeping this at 0. If you're working in an environment in production, you should have a router in place and be able to route between VLANs, so you can feel free to change the VLAN ID to your appropriate local area network for wherever your device is residing. For us, I am going to make a small change here. I'm going to go into my VM network. I'm actually going to call this LAN. I'm going to call this my local area network. It's just a little bit easier for me to recognize what that is. I don't like that standard naming. The other thing I'm going to do is go into security, and if it's not checked on yours, we're going to accept to run this in promiscuous mode. I'm going to save, and now this is updated. The second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to networking. I'm going to go to port groups, and I'm going to add another port group. And I'm going to call this port group monitoring or monitor. Either one will work. I'm going to set this to VLAN ID 4095. And I'm going to go down to security, and I'm going to make sure that I also put this one into promiscuous mode. I'm going to hit add. Now, why would I do that? Why would I need a VLAN 4095? Well, one of the things that VMware does is they say VLAN ID 0 means that we're not going to use VLANs at all. VLAN 4095 is also a code that says we're going to encompass all VLANs. So if we want to set up a way of monitoring ports where that we can set up the equivalent of what a span port would be or a mirror port would be, where we're capturing all ports or all VLANs, this is the way to do it. So if we set this into promiscuous mode on our actual port and we're listening on 4095, it'll aggregate all VLANs coming through that virtual switch. Now for us, it's not going to really matter because we're not using VLANs, but if you're in an environment where you are using VLANs and you have routing set up, then this will allow you to capture all VLANs across your virtual switch. All right. The next thing we want to do is actually upload the file that we downloaded. So we downloaded our offline ISO. We want to actually go into our storage. You'll find our data store. For me, it's data store 1. Yours may be something different. And I'm going to go into my data store browser. Now, you'll see I've already created this, but what I recommend is actually creating a directory. So if you go directly under your data store, create a directory, and you can call this something like ISO files. Now you'll see mine's already created, but this is how you would do it. You can create your directory, whatever you want to name it, just so you know that it's your raw ISOs, because you're going to use this later on. Once you have your ISO files, you want to click on that, and we want to go to upload, and you want to upload the file that we just downloaded from Tenable. Now to save time for this video, I've already done that. And you'll see that it's here at the top of our list. It's Tenable Core OL8, Tenable OT, offline, a date that's associated with its release, .iso. So I've already uploaded this to my data store. Now this will take a little while. So again, while you're waiting on that to upload, you can pause the video until we go into the next section. You want to make sure that this upload is completed before we go forward into creating and setting up your virtual machine. You can track that status down at the bottom. You'll see the actual recent task, and you'll have a task that's going through until it completely successfully completes. Once that happens, we can move on to creating our virtual machine. All right, so our next step is to go in and create a virtual machine, and you'll start to see why we decided to use an ISO instead of actually creating it from a template. What you'll see is we could do the create new virtual machine, which is what we're going to do. Or if we had downloaded the OVA, we could just say deploy a virtual machine from OVA. But remember, this is going to keep all those defaults that we had in place before. So we're going to create a new virtual machine, and we'll hit next. I'm going to name this Tenable OT Core. The reason I'm naming this Tenable OT Core is because I don't want to confuse this with a future deployment that we're going to be doing for sensors. Remember, there's two pieces. We have the Tenable OT Core appliance, and then we have sensors out there. There's a virtualized version of Core, but there's also a virtualized version of sensors that we'll be playing with in the future. When it comes to the guest OS, we know there's a version of Linux because we talked about it's Oracle Linux 8. And then we're going to select Oracle Linux 8 here as well. All right. This is a very important part of the step. If you don't put this in, or if you get that it's the wrong one, like CentOS, I've seen that in the past, what'll end up happening is some of your network adapters won't work the right way, and your install will fail when it comes to the ISO. So you want to make sure that you have Linux and Oracle Linux 8 selected. We're going to hit next. We'll select our data store for where we're going to be building the machine. I'm going to hit next again. And then we're going to put in some of our VM options. Now, the very first thing I want to do is add 3 network adapters. With our hardware devices, one of the things that the ISO is going to be looking for, do I have 4 Ethernet ports or interfaces on that device? So for it to install properly, it needs to see the same level. Today, from the very start, you only have network adapter 1. We actually have to add 3 more. So now you'll see I have my first one and I've added 3 new ones. I'm going to leave all of these to connect in the very beginning. We're going to change this a little bit later on in our install, but for now, we don't know necessarily which order these are going to come up in. We don't know which one's going to be our network interface 0 compared to our network interface 3 for all 4 of these. So once we know what that is, we can start changing some of these and set up which ones connect and which ones don't. All right, now that that's set up, we want to go into CPU. We want to select at least 4 for our lab environment. I recommend more than that, at least 8 if you're going in production. From a memory point of view, I'm going to change this to gigabits, and I'm going to say that we want at least 32. I recommend going as high as 64 to match the hardware that we have deployed. So I would go 8. I recommend at least 64 here to match our hardware. And then when it comes to our hardware disk, by default, we say that the minimum is 205. Now, we're not going to do this. One of the reasons why is it's highly recommended that when you're deploying Tenable OT, that you have enough space for PCAPs to be able to collect. In general, when you talk about the hardware that's sold that Tenable puts out there, there's 3 terabits of storage plus operating system storage that's separate. So you have over 3 terabits of storage for your logs, for your events, for PCAP data. So shrinking this down to 205 means you're going to overwrite files a lot. It's not going to fill up. You don't have to worry about that, but you're going to constantly be filling up your PCAP, and it's going to overwrite very quickly because of the limited space that you have. So I recommend going with at least 1 terabit in this setting. So as you go to 1 terabit, then you should have plenty of room for rollover. That way, if there's some event that happens, if there's malicious activities, you can always recreate that, use that for evidence, and it's not writing over so fast. The next thing we want to do is make sure our provisioning is thick provisioned. And so that'll make sure that we're not expanding spaces at the same time we're trying to write PCAPs or write events to the logs that are going on within the actual tool. Now, for the purposes of this video, and because this is in a lab environment, I'm going to reduce some of these settings. I don't recommend doing that if you're moving into production, but for this video, it's going to help us kind of move through, and it'll run a little bit faster because we're not putting a lot of data on here that's actually tied to a real production environment. So I'm going to bring this back down to 205 as a minimum requirement. I'm going to leave at least 32 gigs so this runs a little bit faster, 4 CPUs. I'm going to go to thin provisioning here. Now, if you're in a lab, this is completely fine. If you're in production, I do not recommend doing this. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my host device for my CD and DVD drive. I'm going to tell it to go to our data store. I'm going to look up my ISO file that I uploaded, and I'm going to grab that. I'm going to hit select, and we should be good to go now. We have all of our settings in here. Let's just check one last time. I'm going to hit next. We'll check this, and we're going to say finish. So we're in a great place now. We have our virtual machine ready to go. We're going to go into that section, and we're going to kick off that machine. Now, one of the things that'll happen as we kick this off is you'll see that we're going to get a prompt to select how we want to install this. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but I want to explain some of the different options. Number one that I want to talk about is testing the media. Now, there's a faster way of doing this. When you download, if you do the checksum and the checksum matches, you're probably pretty good with this. If you haven't done that, it may be wise to check your media to make sure in all your uploads and downloads that you haven't got any corruption that's happened, and it'll verify that you're on a good install. I've seen installs happen, and then there's something buggy on the back end, and it turns out that there is a shift in bits or something, like one portion of this tool didn't work, and for some reason there were problems. I've seen that not just with Tenable Core as an operating system, but many Linux systems if you have a bad download or the checksum doesn't match. So that's the first piece. The second piece, if you're installing on hardware and not in a virtual environment, especially if it's a default hardware that comes from Tenable, you really want to go in, you'll connect your console cable that's over a serial port. You want to make sure that you select Tenable Core using a serial console. This way you'll have output to something like PuTTY over COM3 or over some serial port if you're on Linux, so that you can actually get that output of the install process. If you're in something like VMware Hyper-V, where you have access to the actual console itself, you can do a graphical install through just the regular install Tenable Core. So we're going to go ahead and select that. And we're going to go through a process of installing. Now, some of this I'm going to speed up for us so that you don't have to watch this whole process of installing, but you'll kind of watch that go through. When we're fully installed, what'll happen is it'll reboot twice. They're fairly quick, and then we'll come up with a login screen. And we'll talk about what to do once we get to that login screen. And we have our login screen. So I'm going to let about 60 seconds pass just so all of my internal systems get started up and those sort of things. I'll come back after about 1 minute and we'll start logging in. I'll show you some shortcuts so that we can get this set up so that we're not having to follow the exact instructions that Tenable puts out there for an install. All right, now that a few minutes have passed, we're going to go ahead and log in. Now, by default, the default user when you first start is Wizard. It's all lowercase. And we're going to hit return. The password is admin, all lowercase, ADMIN. And we're going to hit return there. And the first thing it's going to ask us is, do we want to configure a static address? And we're going to say yes. We'll go into configuring our NIC 0 interface, which is our first network card. And we're going to make some changes here. We're going to take note that of the actual device ID. So we'll look at the MAC address. This is going to be important for us. And then we're going to go in and grab our IPv4 configuration. We're going to change it from automatic or DHCP to manual. We're going to hit tab and go over to show. And we're going to add an address on our local network. So for me, I'm on a 10.2.9 and I'm going to give us a 201 address. And we're going to say it's on a /24 CIDR. The CIDR is important, especially if you're on mixed matching. Like I'm a 10, it would be a /8 telling it it's /24. So it doesn't guess and automatically put me on the /8 network. So, but having the CIDR in the IP address is important. We're going to hit next here, and then I'm going to go to my gateway. My gateway is going to be 10.2.9.1. My DNS server is going to be 10.2.9.1. And then I'm going to add a secondary one for Google that's 8.8.8.8 just to make sure. Now that F3B4, I'm going to take a note of that. I don't need to know necessarily the whole MAC address, but this is going to be important to make sure that we set up the right NIC and the right order on these. So I know which one I can turn on and off. So F3B4. I'm going to tab through until I get all the way down to OK. I'm going to go to quit. And it's going to ask me if I want to set up an administrator account. I'm going to say yes. I'm going to give it an admin username of admin. You can make this anything you want. I'm going to hit return, and I'm going to put in a password. Now this password has to be 14 characters and has to include uppercase, lowercase, special character, and a number. Excellent, and then it'll log us out. So now we're in a good place. The next thing I want to do here is I want to test my login. So I'm going to say admin. Perfect. So I'm seeing that I'm able to log in. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to go over to my virtual machine. I want to go into actions and look at my permissions. So each one of these network adapters, I'm going to have a MAC address. And so what we'll be able to do is line these up with having the right address on the right one. So for example, network adapter 2, I can actually say, all right, which one is this? So there's a couple of ways we can verify this. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to say IP, ADDR, and it's going to give me a list of interfaces. So if I didn't remember which one it was or what that MAC address was, I can go look this up. So I'm on F3B4. I can see that under NIC 0. And remember we said F3B4. Now if I go back to my settings, and you'll see F3B4. What that means is that now I can go through and I know that this is my LAN interface. So that's good. Adapter 2 we want to keep. The next thing that I want to do is look up is what is NIC 1. So NIC 1 is on F3BE. This is important because now I can go in and say whatever's on NIC 1 is my monitoring port. So I'm going to look at my NIC 1. F3BE. And so the reason this one's important here is I know that on adapter 3, I actually want to change this to monitoring. So I'm going to put this adapter 3 on monitoring here, and we're good to go. Now the other thing I can do, because I know that this one, this B4, I can actually disconnect these other connections. I can hit save. And now we're in a good place where we know what's up and what we know what's down, and it's mapped correctly within VMware. Now we don't have our monitoring port turned on right now because we're going to do some other special things with that. But we do have it so it's able to, like, if we turn it on, we're able to monitor on the core appliance as well. All right, so now I can exit out of this. So I can say exit. And we can log out. So we're good to go. Now the next thing we want to do is open up a brand new tab. And we can do the rest of our settings here. So I can go to 10.2.9.201 and go to port 8000. Now this will be whatever IP address you give your machine, and we can log in. So it'll tell us that it's not a private connection because of our certificates are self-signed. We're going to go to advanced and we'll proceed and we'll get a login. So on this login, we're going to log in with the account we just made. In my case, it'll be admin. And you'll see that we're completely logged in. It says the system's up to date and we're ready to go. I'm going to turn on administrative access up here at the top, and it's going to ask me for my password again. Excellent. Now, the first thing we want to do is make some sense out of our deployment. So the first thing is under host name. I want to make this something that I know what it is. So how about naming it the same thing we did earlier, is Tenable OT Core. I'm going to change the host name. Perfect. The next thing we want to do is look at our networking. And what you'll see is because we changed the status in our VMware, our NIC 0 is up. We have our IP address that we assigned. We see that it's sending and receiving. And then NIC 1, 2, and 3 are actually not connected right now, which is fine. All we have to have is the interfaces there. If we go into NIC 0, what you'll see is we have the capability to look at our DNS and check that. So you'll see that our primary DNS is on our local network. The secondary is out on Google, and we're not doing any IPv6. So we're good there. All right, so the last thing we want to do is go up to Tenable OT Security. And you'll notice that it says install Tenable OT Security right here. Now, if you're on hardware and you're installing on hardware, you're not going to get this option. This is an option that just comes when you're deploying on a virtual instance. So what we're going to do is we see that our local version right now that we have on our drive is 3.17.40. That's our RPM version, our install version. But you'll see that we don't have any version right now installed. So we want to install OT Security. And this will take several minutes to go through. It'll probably take about 60 seconds, maybe as long as 2 minutes before your logs start populating. But then you'll start seeing the install process. Again, I'll probably speed this video up for this portion, but you'll be able to see a fast version running through until the install is complete. All right, and we look like we're good. The very last thing you'll see in your logs is it'll say starting OT Security. And then you'll also notice that the top where it says our application version and our RPM versions now match. So officially now, Tenable OT is fully installed and ready to go. Now there's one other thing we want to do before we jump right in. I'm going to take us over to the terminal. If you look, this application is good, the version's good. We're going to go down to the terminal section. So let's click on terminal. And we're going to get a command line. In the command line, we're going to type a command docker ps-a. And so what's this going to give us? So the way that Tenable Core or Tenable OT works is it runs on over 20 plus containers that make this all run. And so they're all Docker containers. And we want to make sure that our primary containers are up and running. So if I hit return here, basically this is going to show all Docker processes running and give us a status on each container. I'm going to hit return. And what you'll see is there's several different containers that are up and running. So you'll see that Influx is running, Rabbit is running. You'll see Postgres and Sociology and Shepherd. So there's several of them here that are running. What you're looking for is that the majority of these are running. And so, or I say majority, but about half. Once about half of these are running, this means that your system is ready to begin the install process or the setup process. If you notice that all of these were still down or you didn't have any of these up at all, it probably means that your system is either corrupted or it didn't install properly or something like that. So I'm going to go back to OT Security as a last step, and we can click on this URL at the top. You'll notice that it's a normal IP address, but over 443 instead of going to port 8000. We'll get a not private again for our certificate error. We'll go to advanced and proceed. And this takes us to the setup wizard. And this is probably a good stopping point. So thank you for joining me today. That concludes our video. In our next episode, we'll be talking about how to walk through the setup wizard, how to make sure that you configure things in a way so that the platform will grow with you and give you the best insight for managing any risk or vulnerabilities that are out there in your environment. Until then, have a great day. Leave any comments that you have below. I'm happy to answer those. I check in at least once or twice a day on those, and I'll follow along with that. Until next time, take care.